used to think that cryptocurrency had room only for one. After all, with borderless, cheap-to-use, transparent yet still private, and very divisible internet cash, there isn't much you can do to improve money besides that. It turns out crypto isn't just about currency, and it can be more than cash if we have the vision to see the future and then bring it into being. Today we're joined by David Johnson, Executive Director of BitAngels, and Ron Gross, the Executive Director of the Mastercoin project. Gentlemen, thanks for making the time.
Thanks for having us.
Our listeners have heard about Mastercoin before. I spoke with project founder J.R. Willits towards the end of the fundraising period. Before we talk about that, though, a few days ago, you sent me a white paper that you both are co-authors on, along with some other people, called The Emerging Wave of Decentralized Applications. Using Bitcoin as an example, can you explain how Bitcoin is a decentralized application?
Sure. This is basically a framework that I've been trying to develop with Ron and other people at BitAngels to explain really what this new entity is. You know, people have different names for this. Some people would call them decentralized autonomous corporations. Some people call them cryptocurrencies. But I was trying to get at what the actual function is. And so most people in the end of the day are going to end up interacting with this as a piece of software, right? It's something that they download onto their computer, an IT professional loads it onto a server. And at the end of the day, I use this as a software application. I really do think that's the most useful frame for this. And of course, decentralized is the big differentiator from a typical application. And so in the white paper, I really go into detail and try to offer some useful terminology on how these decentralized applications have to be built on open source, how they have to operate autonomously without one person controlling a majority of their tokens. And I propose that they ought to all have records maintained in cryptographically stored decentralized blockchain. And so it's a pretty broad definition, but as we see more and more of these type of entities, I think it's helpful to have that language to really describe how they work, how they issue their tokens, how they operate. So I'm excited to explore today the possibilities I see, like you said, going beyond just Bitcoin, which I see as the baseline protocol layer. I'm mostly interested in building applications on top of Bitcoin. So you mentioned Mastercoin, and we can get into that in more detail later, but I see it as a great first example of a protocol that's getting built on top of Bitcoin, using it essentially as a back end for time stamping and a universal token system, and the ability to send these tokens around and adding new user layers and functionalities. And so I describe in the white paper sort of the idea of describing this as a type 2 decentralized application because it's building on top of these baseline proof of work. You have the blockchain. That's a baseline type 1 decentralized application, but we can build on top of this, right? We can store metadata in the blockchain, which is actually a lot of what inspired me to write the white papers. We've had this great update as part of 0.9. I don't know, Adam, if you caught the number 5 update that Gavin did to the Foundation's blog that covered provably prunable outputs.
Yeah, I did catch it. Before we go into that, let's take a step back real quick and talk about tokens for a second, because you mentioned tokens a couple of times. And this is a really important differentiation, I think, that a lot of people don't really understand. When you talk about Bitcoin or Bitcoins, when you talk about it, with a lowercase b, you're talking about the tokens, right? You're talking about the actual Bitcoins. But when you're talking about Bitcoin, uppercase B, that is the Bitcoin network or the Bitcoin protocol. And the tokens are essentially, they're tokens that travel that infrastructure. But ultimately, they're called the same thing, but they actually are very different, right?
Exactly. There's two sides of the operation, and a lot of people get confused when they first enter the ecosystem and think the network is the same as the tokens that transverse it.
If the tokens Bitcoins are different than the network Bitcoin, are they both distributed applications, or is the Bitcoin network the distributed application and the Bitcoin tokens are the things that are redeemable and essentially power the network?
That's a really good question. I would probably lean towards saying that the distributed network that underlies Bitcoin is the decentralized application. And as you said, you have this token that is used to access the features of this particular type of application. And so when you create a new layer and a new protocol, you have a different application. And again, you have an associated token that can access its features, sort of like you need a specific token to access any other type of application on the internet. It's just here we have a a finite number of tokens.
Okay, and so when you're talking about layers with regards to these like protocol layers, that can be thought of like the base level of the internet is TCP/IP. That's the base communication level that's essentially going on at any given time. And then there's the HTTP layer that's essentially built on top of that. And that is where we find the modern internet that, you have Facebook and modern web applications built on. They're not built explicitly on top of TCP/IP. The layer that they're built on exists and runs on top of TCP/IP, and then they're built on top of that layer. So by this definition, could you call something like Facebook a type 3 built on top of a secondary layer of TCP/IP?
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. Or could also say a browser is a type 3, right? So you have TCP, IP, you have HTTP, and then we've built all these things on top of HTTP, browsers, search engines, social networks. But they all exist at that same level.
So are these additional levels, or are they more levels? Are they just all type 3s?
I think of them all as type 3s. And so that's the analogy that I use in the white paper, is if we thought of the operating system as my type 1, right? Here's the baseline, or we use that operating system as the baseline. Then you have all these companies that operate in different tech stacks, right? There's the Google and Amazon and Facebook, right? They all have their own individual tech stacks. And then on top of that, most of the applications people interact with are inside the marketplaces of those tech stacks, right? That's just another example of sort of layered operating systems and protocols that work together, right? An operating system, a particular tech stack, and then let's say it's the Apple tech stack. You have hundreds of thousands of user applications that are offered on their marketplace, right? And that's sort of all level 3. You can think of Apple as that level 2 and the operating system in which they're operating as level 1.
Okay, so then tying this back around to Bitcoin, taking Mastercoin as an example here, Bitcoin would be the layer 1, it would be the type 1, because it's built just on top of nothing. It's just an edifice out there in space that people can use for what it's used for. And then Mastercoin, which is the project that you guys are working on right now, is a type 2 built on top of Bitcoin. And then you're hypothesizing that Mastercoin is the equivalent of the web browser in this case, and you'll have additional applications built on top of that that'll use Mastercoin's infrastructure, which uses Bitcoin's infrastructure.
Right. That's a good way of thinking about it. And the reason I think it makes sense to build on top of Bitcoin instead of creating a separate blockchain is a couple of reasons. You have the security advantage immediately being on top of a network which has enormous hashing power, and thus doing a false transaction or double spend is impossibly costly, right? I remember it just recently crossed $1 billion of calculation to do a false spend on the Bitcoin. So you get that immediately, right? If I was creating another type 1 decentralized application that had its own blockchain, and we're mining at day 1, you don't have that security advantage. And so I think that's probably really important to build on top of. That's a big advantage. And that gives you a lot of stability on which to build on top of it. But you don't need to do mining again now that you already have this base layer. And so versus proof of work, Mastercoin and similar applications are working on a proof of stake. And so based on the number of coins and tokens somebody holds, they can vote on protocol changes and things like that. And instead of rewarding hashing power and confirming transactions, which are really positive value-added behaviors by the users when it comes to a type 1, you can incentivize different behaviors by users for a type 2. So for instance, with Mastercoin, it's basically been incentivizing 2 different behaviors. First, there was the Kickstarter period, you can call it, right? The 30-day, those that want to support these particular features can add in funds to a particular Bitcoin address, and they will get part of the initial tokens that are generated. And then there's a second pool, which most people forget about, which is the developer pool. And it's rewarding anybody that provides open source contributions to the project with dev Mastercoins. So there's these 2 different pools, and you're incentivizing 2 different behaviors. One is to initially provide the funding so all of these things can be developed and the implementations can be built. And then second, in the long term, it's a controlled algorithm where 50% of the dev coins are handed out the first year, and then 25% the second year, and then 12.5% the third year, and so on and so forth, right? Sort of emulating that Bitcoin distribution over time with the dev coins. But I think those are different buckets you can think about these incentives in.
Is there any difference between dev Mastercoins and actual Mastercoins? Like, were they created differently, or are they just, were they allocated?
So I think David and I and a few other board members have different perspectives about the functionality and the division between these types of Mastercoins. At the end of the day, these are both Mastercoins, and they're both fungible and interchangeable, right? The only difference is that the normal Mastercoins were created by sending money to the Exodus address over the investment in August. And the dev Mastercoins are generated throughout the rest of the project lifetime, the exponential decay that David described. Now, the dev Mastercoins are currently managed by the group of people known as the Mastercoin Foundation, right? And they're managed by us with the explicit purpose of being used in order to develop the protocol. But technically, and from a financial perspective, two types of coins are the same.
I actually kind of followed the Mastercoin project, and I'm not that familiar with the dev coins. Is there somewhere in particular where I could find more information about how that allocation happened or what the rules are there?
Yeah, the rules for that allocation were there in the original spec, in the original white paper. They were called reward Mastercoins back then, but we renamed them to dev Mastercoins, and then Willett described the original allocation algorithm. We are refining that right now with David is pushing the exact semantics, but nothing has basically changed.
So we've talked kind of around Mastercoin for a while here, and I'd like to actually focus on that for a second. At a really basic level, can you tell me what the purpose of the Mastercoin project is and has been? What is the goal that you guys are working towards actually solving?
Well, one of the things that got me really excited about this is the community, the Bitcoin community. As long as I've been in it the last year and a half or so, there's been a demand for, we need a decentralized exchange where we can buy and sell all these digital tokens. And we've seen throughout time all the centralized versions, whether it's BTCT or others, they come and they go. And so if you offer smart property tokens, these exchanges don't stick around very long. And it's because they're run as centralized entities and they can't manage the regulatory burden globally. And so it's been recognized by the community for a while. We really, really need a centralized exchange. And so when I saw that was basically the first feature, and it was pretty straightforward technically to implement that with Mastercoin, that's what got me really, really excited. I can't emphasize the importance of that enough, because once you have a decentralized exchange that is completely open source and the records are kept in the Bitcoin blockchain, those records aren't going anywhere. They're secure, they're safe, you don't have to worry about another centralized exchange closing down. And from a regulatory perspective, because there's no entity, because there's no centralization, the burden goes to those use particular jurisdictions to say, oh, okay, I can use these smart property features, I can use these tokens and this decentralized exchange in this way in my jurisdiction. And it doesn't have to be a global solution. You can come up with unique solutions, just like in Bitcoin, right? There's no Bitcoin company. And so people have been free to set up exchanges in their particular jurisdictions, however they have to do that. And so it's different in the United States than it is in Canada, than it is in Germany, than it is in Japan. And that diversity is really, really key, I think, to making this work. And so decentralized exchange, to me, was one of the very first features. That's what the current bounty, the $250,000 300 BTC bounty, is focused on, is the decentralized exchange. I think it's under testing right now. People can go and check out the developer thread. They can check out what's going on with that and test it out, download the wallets. And that's really exciting to me because it gives us a whole new range of capabilities as a community.
So when you say decentralized exchange, the problem we're talking about here is the one trading dollars or yen or whatever your local currency is for Bitcoin, right? Is it an exchange for Mastercoin, or is it an exchange for Bitcoin, or is it just an exchange?
What David said about all these kind of smart property features on top of Bitcoin or Mastercoin, that's very much correct and true. I just want to say that back at August, we didn't even imagine these features. J.R. Willett, for the last year and a half, when he worked on the protocol, only focused at first on the currency and commodity exchanges. He described the protocol where people can issue their own currencies, and be it either US dollars or yens or euros or gold, and then the same unified exchange platform handles all of these exchanges, all of these currencies and assets. It was only 1 or 2 months ago when we added the smart property feature, which now we're discovering it's a very important part of this ecosystem, right? If before we were more like a Forex sort of platform, now we're also a stock exchange. People can issue these tokens, this smart property, and just exchange any type of financial asset. And we keep imagining and coding and defining new types of assets from the financial system into this system, right? Once we cover the basic ground, now we can move on to futures and options and various other types of contracts and bets. If I make a bet on top of the Mastercoin protocol, now this bet is a financial asset and I can sell this bet off to someone else if I'm not satisfied with it. So the exchange is like the unifying holy grail here that just binds everything together. It's like the force.
So this is more about tokens being traded for tokens. So I can sell Bitcoin for Mastercoin. And then so once I have Mastercoin, I can interact with any of these user currencies that have been created on top of the Mastercoin protocol, which is really, really exciting. Though I do want to make one clarification. We talked about earlier the dev Mastercoins and they're being vested to the programmers. I want to point out that this is one point of centralization that we really don't like about the current implementation, this process needing to be managed by the Mastercoin Foundation. And so what we're striving to do is, number one, we've put a bounty system in place where anybody can compete for this. Number two, we're working on a proof of stake system so that all those that are in the Mastercoin community can vote with their proof of stake based on the features and the bounties that they want. And so our goal over the coming months is to have a distributed bounty system and completely remove Mastercoin Foundation from the equation and have the entire process with the bounties using proof of stake run by the community as a whole. And we see that as one of our really, really important objectives in the coming months. And Ron could talk more about that. He's the one that originally proposed proof of stake and is a big advocate of this distributed bounty system.
Before we get into that, proof of stake is in place because you don't have the incentive structure of mining, right? You've
Right.
bypassed this by using Bitcoin as your infrastructure. They do mining on Bitcoin, so you're secured by that. Is there anything you're trying to accomplish with a proof of stake system besides giving people a way to give you feedback? Because that's what you're using it as primarily as. Like the more you have, the more your voice counts.
It's a way for us to control what versions and new protocol updates are made to the clients. Because in Bitcoin, right, if a new update 0.9 is pushed, a majority of the nodes have to accept this new version. Otherwise, there's a hard fork. Well, we need the same kind of function, right? Because we have an update to the protocol. How do we know all the stakeholders want this update? We're using proof of stake for that.
We said the phrase proof of stakes a lot of times so far. So it's important for me to make it clear that proof of stake isn't necessarily the very same concept of proof of stake as it's used in peer coins or in other currencies. In peer coin, proof of stake is used as an actual mining device. You commit your coins and you generate new coins by proving your stake. So we're just inspired by them and maybe we'll incorporate some of these same ideas later. But right now, we're using proof of stake as just literally proving your stake in the project. The users prove that they own coins, but they don't generate new Mastercoins out of that. Instead of generating new coins, the users can affect the protocol in two key ways. Right now, we have our funds, both Bitcoins and Mastercoin, and we're holding them. The Mastercoin Foundation is holding these coins, and we're allocating them in order to develop the protocol and promote it and develop the websites and various other needs. So instead of us doing this allocation manually by board vote or in any other way, our goal is to move all this decision process into the users themselves. So users will see all these kinds of votes for budgets or bounties, and they will be able to approve or deny any bounty that they see, right? And thus they can control all the funds that are locked away in the protocol. This is the one aspect, managing the funds. Another aspect is just managing the protocol, right? And deciding what Mastercoin is. So David talked about how miners in Bitcoin sort of vote with their hash power, right, and decide how the protocol goes. That's part of the equation. That's not the complete story. For example, if all miners, or if 75% of miners in Bitcoin decided to keep minting new blocks, which each of them having 50 coins instead of the current 25 coins, that change wouldn't have happened, right? Because there is an economic majority here, and users have to accept this change as well. But the key thing is that mining is still a very important part of the decision process that defines what Bitcoin is, right? If there's a new patch that is maybe controversial, like Gavin's patch last year, so miners can use their hash power to decide this. And in Mastercoin, the equivalent is voting with your Mastercoins. So if you own a certain amount of Mastercoins, you can see which protocol changes are coming up, and you can choose which ones you like or dislike and vote on this accordingly.
EasyDNS is the Swiss Army knife for your domain names, helping meet their customers' individual needs since 1998. EasyDNS has been an outspoken critic of SOPA and CISPA. EasyDNS was an early supporter of Bitcoin, and now they are proud to sponsor this show. Do business with a company that shares your values. Get a 13% discount when you pay with Bitcoin. Go to bitcoin.easydns.com and be sure to use discount code LTB.